Bava Batra Daf Kuf Samach Amud Bet. Power without character is toxic. Get Mekushar Avdi Rabbonen Taqanta. I'm speaking to you from this beautiful Lake Arrowhead in California, where we've spent a wonderful few days with children and grandchildren. Lake Arrowhead is interesting because it was a private initiative exactly 100 years ago, built to provide water for this entire region. And it strikes me how much business can do, how much chesed business can do when its motivations are applied properly and for the interests of society and the interests of humanity. Here for 100 years, the builders of this magnificent piece of engineering have been supplying water to tens of thousands of people or more. And it's not just business that can be such a powerful force if correctly applied, and such a destructive force if applied without any kind of parameters, any kind of moral and ethical parameters. But all forms of power have the capacity to be toxic and destructive, and the capacity to be incredibly supportive and enabling of human accomplishment, achievement, and well-being. Governments establish certain checks and balances to keep power restrained, to keep power within the guidelines, within the barriers of what is appropriate and what is good. But even that is not always enough. The most important balance for power is character. Yet sometimes it's necessary to legislate so that power does not overflow into a torrent of destruction for people under the influence of the powerful figure or powerful institution. Let's have a look at our Gemara, where we have a strange situation. The Gemara, we start now a new perek, Get Pashut, where the Gemara introduces us, the Mishnah introduces us to two different types of gittin. Get here doesn't mean a divorce document necessarily, it means any document. The two documents are Get Pashut and a Get Mekushar. A straightforward get, a blank, a flat get, and a bound get. And I would advise you in this piece of Gemara not to get too tied up in what a bound get looks like. We don't really know for sure. It was used in the time of the first temple and not much after that period of time. All we do know about it is it was a complicated construction of a document that was quite time-consuming to create. That's what's relevant for us. It had to be bound in very particular and meticulous ways that took a lot of time. And there were these two gittin, and they had different requirements as far as signatures were concerned, various other different halachot, and the Mishnah describes the differences. But the Gemara starts off by saying, Minah hanimili. In other words, as the Rashbam explains, where do we even know that there are these two different kinds of gittin, these two different types of documents? And the Gemara goes through various attempts to learn it from psukim, from verses in the Tanakh, and the Gemara then comes to the conclusion, no, there's no Torah source for it. There are Torah suggestions, but there's no Torah source as such. The rabbis legislated it, and they simply used the psukim, they used these verses as indications that this was the right thing to do. Why then did the Rabbonen create this complicated form of document? Atra de Kahane have. You see, says the Gemara, this was done in a town where there were a lot of Kohanim, and they happened to be very impulsive people who got angry easily, and they decided on a whim to divorce their wives. And the Rabbonen created this mechanism of a very complex and time-consuming document to be written, so that by the time the document was written, they would have calmed down and would possibly change their minds. What's interesting is that the Rambam paskins in Hilchot Dayot, in the second chapter of Hilchot Dayot, that anger is one of those things, one of those midot, one of the few midot that we should not entertain at all. Most midot, explains the Rambam, there are times where they have a use, and we have to find the middle way where we're not too much to one extreme or to the other extreme, the Rambam's famous golden path. But when it comes to arrogance and anger, says the Rambam, these are really bad midot, and we shouldn't entertain them at all. And the question here in this piece of Gemara is, why do we find chazal accommodating the anger of the Kohanim in this particular town and protecting them from their own impulsiveness, giving them a mechanism which now becomes standard for all of Klal Yisrael, for the Jewish people, because in this one town there's a group of impulsive Kohanim who make decisions familial decisions, important decisions that are really important, and they divorce their wives. And you see the relevance of the fact that they are Kohanim is because a Kohen, as the Rashbam explains, cannot remarry a wife he is divorced. So if he changes his mind after the divorce takes effect, he can't say, well, I've changed my mind and let's get together again, because the Torah tells us, Isha grusha me'isha lo yikachu. A Kohen is not allowed to take back a wife who he has divorced. He's not allowed to marry a divorcee, even his own divorcee. And therefore we want to protect him. But why are we protecting a person from his own anger? He shouldn't be angry. We don't protect people from the other things they shouldn't do. I guess sometimes we do. There are many takanot de Rabbanan, there are many laws of the rabbis that are to protect us from doing something wrong. You're not allowed to write on Shabbat. That's a prohibition of the Torah. And there's a takana, the rabbis create legislation that you don't even move a pen or a pencil, so as to make it easier not to write subconsciously without intention. So we do see the rabbis protecting ourselves from ourselves, but that's when it's human nature. Kas, anger, the Rambam tells us, is not human nature. You can master your anger, you can overcome your anger, and you shouldn't have any anger. Why are we making accommodation for these Kohanim who are unable to control their own anger and their own impulses? It's quite interesting because the Yad Ramah, an important Rishon on Bava Batra, and we've had him several times before, explains that it's natural for Kohanim, based on the Gemara in Kiddushin Daf Ayin, that Kohanim generally are more stubborn than others, and the Malshor over there explains why that is, almost justifying that this is not a bad midah, this is not somebody who has no control over his character. This is a natural tendency of this particular group of people, but it doesn't seem that that's how Tosfot learns, and particularly it seems clear that this was for a particular town in which the Kohanim were impulsive. Our Gemara doesn't really refer to the general impulsive. Yes, the Gemara in Kiddushin talks about the fact that they're strong-willed and they can be stubborn, but here we're talking about Kas, as the Rashbam quite clearly says, Mitoch Kas, they divorced their wives out of anger. And the Gemara in Kiddushin is not talking about anger, it's talking about azut, about stubbornness, which is different. And this anger, rather, is that kind of anger which the Rambam says we should have nothing of. So once again, why are we accommodating these Kohanim in a situation where they shouldn't be angry in the first place? But if we study the Tosfot together, I think we will understand an important principle that emerges from this piece of Gemara. Tosfos asks the question and says, "Mesapka lan bizman hazeh kashekohen megaresh ishto im tzarich la'asot mekusha." What about nowadays? Do we still have to follow this practice of this very complex document that bound in this complex way? Because after all, it was a takana. The rabbis did legislate it. They did institute it. Should we do this today as well? Now, when Tosfos asks this question, he's not really asking, I wonder whether we should or we shouldn't, although that's how it's worded. Clearly, Tosfos could look around him and see that all the great people of his time and the times before were not doing that. And we often take our line when it comes to halakha and it comes to Masorah from what the great people of our times and the times before us have done as a matter of principle. And here we find, since the end of the First Temple, this wasn't a practice. So Tosfos knows it's not a practice. What Tosfos is worried about is, what do we do about the takana? How can you just stop doing something because we don't know exactly how to do it? We don't know how to do it because we stopped doing it. Why did we stop doing it? If this is a law of the rabbis, why is it not consistent through the generations? Tosfos gives two answers, and it's the third answer that we'll focus on, which is the answer of the Ri. And Ri says, Ri haya omer, detakinu rabbanon mekushar, lo sheyehei chova la'asoto kein. The Chachamim did not say, this is the way you need to write a document. This is the way you need to write a get, a document of divorce. It must be bound in this particular way. It was not a law of gittin. It was not a law of divorce, and it was not a law of document writing. This was something different. Ela kedei shelo yafsidu neshoteihem hitkinu la'asot kein. And here the translation of the words of Tosfos are really important. I've seen that some, in explaining and translating this Tosfot in some of the modern versions of the Gemaras, talk about the fact that the Chachamim legislated in this way so as to protect the husband's ability to remarry their wives so that they should not find themselves in a situation where they've lost their wives. But if you look at the wording of Tosfot, I don't believe that's what Ri is saying, because Ri does not say shelo yafsidu et neshotehem. That word et would indicate that the word neshotehem, their wives, is the object of the sentence, meaning that they instituted this law so that the men would not lose their wives, the object. But there isn't an et there. Shelo yafsidu neshotehem means that neshotehem, the wives, are the subject of the sentence, not the object of the sentence. Shelo yafsidu neshotehem means so that the wives don't lose out because their husbands are unreasonably impulsive and angry. And so they instituted this to protect the wives. That doesn't mean that if you don't write the get this particular way, the get is not valid. A get pashut is valid. A document written in the simple normal form that we write them today is perfectly valid. It was just in that particular area and time to protect the wives from their angry and impulsive husbands. So now if we come back to our initial question and say, why is the Gemara, why do the chazal legislate to protect an individual from his own bad character? The answer is no, we're not protecting him from his bad character. Let him suffer the consequences. We're not worried about him. But why should his wife suffer the consequences of his bad character? We've given him power. We've given a man power. We've given a husband power over his wife. And we've created certain legal guardrails to protect her. But we know very well there are times when even those legal guardrails are insufficient. And when unscrupulous, bad-charactered men hold their wives hostage in not giving them gittin, we know the suffering that causes. The agunot, the women who are now left in limbo and can't remarry because of their husband's stubbornness and meanness, so that the halakha can't always make accommodation to balance and protect others from the power that the Torah gives individuals or institutions. Power is a function of society. It's a function not only of politics, but a function of any society. There will be certain individuals that have power over others. There will be certain institutions that have power over others. And in places like the United States and other democracies where balances of power are introduced to try and moderate that power, that helps somewhat, but it doesn't help entirely. A bad person who gets into a position of power can become enormously toxic and use his or her power to the detriment of others. And here we have a case where chazal step in and are willing to create legislation that affects the way that all batei din, all courts of law throughout the world and all times, theoretically, have to create their documents in complicated ways so as to protect the wives, shelo yafsidu neshotehem, so that their wives should not suffer the consequences of powerful men who act impulsively in a moment of anger and use their power destructively, and thereafter cannot correct it because they're Kohanim. If they weren't Kohanim, they could apologize and remarry their wives if the wives wanted to remarry them. But if they were Kohanim, they weren't able to even do that, and so the Chachamim created this law. Therefore, it's kinu la'asot chen. That's why they made the law. Now, as Tosfot has stated, this is not something that we do today. But as in all our Gemara, what's important as we learn Gemara, as opposed to learning Shulchan Aruch, for example, is we're not learning it so much in order to know what to do in the specific instances that the Gemara is covering. When we're learning the laws of sacrifices, it's not only to know how to bring sacrifices in times when we can. When we're learning certain laws of Kohanim or certain laws that apply only to Batei Din, to courts of law, what we've got to learn is the underlying principle which affects us and applies to us. And so although we no longer write documents this way, the principle is there that bad midot, bad character, is something to be avoided at all costs. Particularly arrogance, egoism, and anger are midot, as the Rambam says, to be avoided at all costs. And even more so, those of us who find ourselves in positions of influence, authority, and power need to be even more meticulous in how self-aware we are and how we develop and evolve ourselves to remove ego and remove the propensity to anger, so that never do we cause unnecessary suffering to the people we lead because of our own inadequacies. It's the inner place from which we come. It's the quality of our inner beings that is the most important guardrail for the power that the Torah gives us.